Torben kicked the reinforced steel door shut behind him, just as the screaming started upstairs. 3 bullets had already punched through the chapel's stained glass windows, and he could hear boots stomping across the wooden pews above his head. The timer on his wrist showed 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until feeding time, and these mercenaries had picked the worst possible night to raid St. Casimir's. He grabbed the meat hook from its wall mount and sprinted down the stone corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white. Behind him, someone was trying to break down the steel door with what sounded like a sledgehammer. Good luck with that. The door was built to keep things in, not out, but it worked both ways. Rule 1, Torben muttered, checking his watch again. Feed at midnight, no exceptions. 11 minutes. The corridor stretched ahead for another 50 yards before ending at the feeding chamber. Torben had made this run 1,847 times over the past 5 years. Tonight felt different. Tonight, people were trying to kill him while he worked. An explosion rocked the chapel above. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. These weren't ordinary thieves looking for church donations. Someone had sent professionals, and they'd brought enough firepower to level the building, but they didn't understand what they were messing with. Torben reached the first checkpoint and punched in his access code. The heavy door slid open with a soft hiss. Rule 2. Never enter the feeding chamber without proper clearance. The biometric scanner beeped green as it read his fingerprint. 9 minutes. The feeding chamber was a circular room carved directly from bedrock. In the center sat a steel grate covering a shaft that dropped down into complete darkness. Torben couldn't see the bottom, even with a flashlight, but he could hear movement down there. Slow, deliberate sounds like something large shifting its weight. He opened the industrial freezer and pulled out tonight's offering. 60 pounds of fresh beef, still dripping. Rule 3. Only raw meat. Never cooked, never seasoned, never frozen for more than 48 hours. The entity below was particular about its food. 7 minutes. The steel door behind him rang like a bell as something heavy slammed into it. These guys were persistent. Torben activated the chamber's lockdown sequence. Thick metal barriers slid into place, sealing him inside. Now even a tank couldn't reach him. But the lockdown was only temporary. In 90 minutes, the barriers would retract automatically. If he wasn't finished by then, things would get complicated. 6 minutes. Torben attached the meat to the feeding apparatus. A motorized pulley system that would lower the food down the shaft at exactly the right speed. Too fast and the entity got agitated. Too slow and it started climbing. He'd seen what happened when it climbed. The cleanup had taken 3 days. 5 minutes. Another explosion shook the building. These mercenaries weren't giving up. Torben wondered who had hired them. Probably the same government agency that had been sniffing around the chapel for months, asking questions about unusual seismic activity and strange reports from local residents. They could ask all the questions they wanted. Torben wasn't talking. 4 minutes. He checked the meat one more time. 60 pounds exactly, cut into regulation strips. Rule 4. Consistent portions. The entity had a precise appetite, and deviating from the schedule caused problems. Big problems. 3 minutes. The sound from below was getting louder. A rhythmic scraping, like massive claws against stone. The entity knew feeding time was approaching. It was getting ready. 2 minutes. Torben positioned himself at the control panel. His finger hovered over the activation switch. Everything had to be perfect. The timing, the amount, the delivery speed. One mistake and the entity would break containment. He'd seen the containment protocols. If the entity ever got loose, the entire facility would be flooded with a nerve agent that killed everything within a 5-mile radius, including him. 1 minute. The timer on his wrist beeped softly. Midnight. Torben hit the switch. The pulley system hummed to life, lowering the meat into the shaft. The scraping sounds below intensified, then stopped completely. For a moment, the chamber was silent except for the quiet whir of the motor. Then came the feeding sounds. Torben had heard them thousands of times, but they still made him clench his jaw. Wet tearing noises, the crunch of bones being crushed, and underneath it all, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The entity was eating. Rule 5. Never look down the shaft during feeding time. Torben kept his eyes on the control panel, watching the depth readings as the pulley descended. 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet. The shaft went deeper than most people realized. Much deeper. At 347 feet, the motor stopped. The meat had reached its destination. The feeding sounds grew louder, more frantic. Whatever was down there was tearing through 60 pounds of beef like it hadn't eaten in weeks. But Torben knew better. He'd fed it yesterday, just like every day for the past 5 years. The entity was always hungry. 3 minutes later, the sound stopped. The motor reversed, pulling the empty feeding apparatus back to the surface. All that remained was bare metal hooks, cleaned completely. Feeding complete. Torben checked his watch. 12:04 a.m., right on schedule. Now he had to deal with the mercenaries upstairs. He opened the weapons locker built into the chamber wall. Inside were 3 assault rifles, enough ammunition to fight a small war, and his personal favorite, a modified shotgun that fired special rounds designed for close-quarters combat. The lockdown would lift in 86 minutes. That gave him time to plan. Torben pulled up the chapel's security system on the chamber's computer terminal. 12 heat signatures moving through the building. They'd split into 3 teams of 4, methodically searching every room. Professional formation, military-grade equipment, coordinated communication. These weren't random hired guns. Someone really wanted him dead, or maybe they wanted the entity. Torben studied the mercenaries' movement patterns on the thermal display. They were being careful, checking every corner, every closet. But they didn't know about the building's hidden passages. St. Casimir's had been built in 1847, back when the Catholic Church had different priorities. The original architects had included several concealed routes between the main chapel and the basement levels. Torben had memorized every inch of those passages during his first year on the job. Time to put that knowledge to use. He activated the emergency ventilation system. Fresh air began flowing through the chamber, carrying away the lingering smell of raw meat. Then he opened a hidden panel in the chamber wall, revealing a narrow passage that led directly to the chapel's bell tower. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, and the climb was steep, but it would put him behind the mercenaries. They'd expect him to come from below. They wouldn't expect him to drop down from above. Torben slung the modified shotgun across his back and started climbing. The passage was carved from the same bedrock as the feeding chamber, with metal handholds installed every few feet. It angled upward at a sharp incline, following the chapel's outer wall. Torben had used this route only once before, during a fire evacuation drill, but muscle memory guided him through the darkness. After 10 minutes of climbing, he reached the bell tower access hatch. Through the thin metal, he could hear voices directly below. Second floor clear, moving to the basement level. Copy that. Team 2 has the main entrance secured. Team 3 is checking the rectory. Any sign of the target? Negative, but we found the steel door. Give us another few minutes with the charges. Torben smiled grimly. They were still trying to blow their way into the feeding chamber. By the time they succeeded, he'd be long gone. He eased the access hatch open and slipped into the bell tower. The massive bronze bell hung silent above him, its surface reflecting moonlight from the tower's windows. From here, he could see the entire chapel layout. 3 SUVs were parked outside, engines running. A 4th mercenary stood guard near the vehicles, scanning the perimeter with night vision goggles. Smart. They weren't taking any chances. Torben moved to the tower's spiral staircase and began descending. His footsteps were silent on the stone steps, years of practice keeping his movements quiet. At the 3rd floor landing, he paused to check the security feed on his phone. The mercenaries were exactly where he expected them to be. 4 men trying to break down the steel door, 4 more searching the basement storage rooms, and 4 covering the exits. Textbook military operation. Too bad they didn't know who they were dealing with. Torben had been a combat engineer in the army before taking this job. Explosives, tactical demolition, close quarters combat, all skills that translated well to his current line of work. Keeping the entity contained required more than just throwing meat down a hole. Sometimes it required violence. He reached the 2nd floor and stopped at a window overlooking the chapel's rear courtyard. 2 mercenaries were positioned near the emergency exit, automatic weapons ready. They were good, but they were focused on preventing escape, not dealing with an attack from inside the building. Torben opened the window and aimed his shotgun. The first shot took out the mercenary on the left. The special rounds were designed for maximum stopping power at close range. The man dropped instantly, his weapon clattering across the stone courtyard. The second mercenary spun toward the sound, but Torben was already adjusting his aim. The second shot sent the man tumbling backward into a decorative fountain. 2 down, 10 to go. Alarms started blaring from the mercenaries' radio equipment. They knew they were under attack now. Torben heard running footsteps in the chapel below as the teams repositioned. Contact! 2 men down in the rear courtyard. Where's the shooter? Unknown. Could be anywhere. Torben moved away from the window and headed for the main chapel. Time to even the odds some more. The chapel's nave was a long, rectangular space filled with wooden pews and dominated by an elaborate altar at the far end. Stained glass windows lined the walls, depicting various saints and biblical scenes. Under normal circumstances, it was a peaceful place for prayer and reflection. Tonight, it was a battlefield. Torben entered through a side door behind the altar. 4 mercenaries were positioned near the main entrance, their weapons trained on the basement access door. They expected him to come from below. He opened fire from behind the altar's marble columns. The modified shotgun roared in the confined space, its echo bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. The first mercenary went down immediately. The second managed to turn and return fire, but his shots went wide, chipping pieces off the marble columns. Torben shifted position and fired again. Another mercenary dropped. The remaining 2 dove for cover behind the wooden pews, but the antique furniture offered little protection against Torben's special rounds. He methodically destroyed their hiding spots, forcing them into the open. When the shooting stopped, 4 more mercenaries were dead. 6 down, 6 to go. Torben reloaded quickly and checked his phone. The remaining mercenaries had retreated to defensive positions near the basement entrance. They were regrouping, probably calling for backup. But backup wouldn't arrive in time. The feeding chamber's lockdown would lift in 37 minutes, and Torben planned to be long gone by then. He made his way toward the basement, moving carefully through the chapel's side corridors. The mercenaries would be expecting another frontal assault. Instead, he was going to hit them from their blind spot. The chapel's original blueprints showed a maintenance tunnel that connected the basement to the old coal storage room. The tunnel had been sealed decades ago, but Torben had reopened it during his first year on the job. Emergency exits were always useful in his line of work. He found the hidden entrance behind a false wall in the rectory kitchen. The tunnel beyond was narrow and dusty, but it led directly to the basement level where the mercenaries were waiting. Torben crawled through the tunnel for 50 yards before reaching the sealed access point. Beyond the thin wall, he could hear voices. Alpha Team, report. No response from Alpha Team. What about Beta? Same, no response. Jesus, how many guys does this Torben have working for him? Just me, Torben thought with grim satisfaction. He placed a small explosive charge against the wall and moved back 20 feet. The blast would be contained just enough to create an opening without bringing down the ceiling. The explosion was sharp and sudden. Before the dust settled, Torben was moving through the hole in the wall. The first mercenary never saw him coming. Torben's shotgun took him down before he could raise his weapon. The second mercenary managed to get off a few shots, but he was firing blind through the dust and debris. Torben put him down with a single shot. The third mercenary had better reflexes. He rolled behind a support column and returned fire with his assault rifle. Bullets sparked off the stone walls, filling the air with rock chips and ricochets. Torben flanked him through the basement's storage area, using the maze of boxes and equipment to mask his approach. When he had a clear shot, he took it. One mercenary left. The final man had barricaded himself behind an overturned table near the steel door. Smart positioning. He could cover both the main entrance and the corridor leading back to the chapel, but he couldn't cover everything. Torben had one more trick up his sleeve. The basement's emergency lighting system was controlled from a panel near the furnace room. He shot out the control box, plunging the entire level into complete darkness. The mercenary's night vision goggles would give him some advantage, but not enough. Torben knew every inch of this basement. He'd been working here for 5 years, and he could navigate it blindfolded. He moved through the darkness like a hunter, using sound and memory to track his target. The mercenary was breathing hard, probably scared now that he was alone in the dark with a man who'd just killed 11 of his teammates. Torben found him crouched behind the table, night vision goggles scanning frantically for movement. The man's hands were shaking. "Looking for me?" Torben asked quietly. The mercenary spun toward the sound, but Torben was already moving. The final shot echoed through the basement. Then everything was silent. 12 down. 0 to go. Torben checked his watch. The lockdown would lift in 14 minutes. Time to clean up and get out of here. He gathered the mercenaries' weapons and equipment, dumping everything into a trash bag. Their bodies would have to stay where they fell. The cleanup crew would handle them tomorrow, just like they'd handled similar situations in the past. The entity below required secrecy above all else. Anyone who threatened that secrecy had to be eliminated. Torben made his way back to the feeding chamber as the lockdown timer reached 0. The heavy barriers retracted with a soft hydraulic hiss, revealing the empty corridor beyond. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The feeding apparatus was clean and ready for tomorrow night's delivery. The steel grate was secure. The entity below was quiet, probably sleeping off its meal. Just another successful feeding. Torben gathered his personal belongings and headed for the emergency exit. His truck was parked 3 blocks away, hidden in an abandoned warehouse. By dawn, he'd be halfway across the state, following protocols that had been drilled into him during his first week on the job. If the facility was compromised, evacuate immediately. Don't look back. Don't try to be a hero. But as he reached the exit, Torben paused. Something was bothering him. The mercenaries had been too well informed, too well equipped. They'd known about the steel door, the basement layout, even his name. Someone on the inside had provided intelligence, someone who knew about the entity, someone who wanted it exposed. Torben stepped outside into the cool night air and activated his encrypted phone. Time to make some calls. The feeding schedule couldn't be interrupted, which meant finding the leak and plugging it permanently. The entity below would be hungry again tomorrow night, and Torben intended to be there to feed it, no matter who tried to stop him. The phone rang twice before Director Vance picked up. "Torben, I heard there was some trouble at St. Casimir's tonight." Torben accelerated through a red light, checking his mirrors for pursuit. The streets were empty at 2 a.m., but he wasn't taking chances. 12 mercenaries with military-grade equipment. They knew about the steel door, the basement layout, and my feeding schedule. Someone talked. "That's impossible. Only 4 people have access to that information. Then one of those 4 people is dead by morning." Vance was quiet for a moment. "Come to the secondary facility. We'll sort this out." The secondary facility was a warehouse complex on the industrial side of town, officially listed as a meat processing plant. Torben had been there exactly once during his initial briefing 5 years ago. The place gave him the creeps, which was saying something considering where he worked. He parked between 2 refrigerated trucks and walked to the employee entrance. The door opened before he could knock. "Torben Reed," said a woman in a lab coat. "Dr. Elizabeth Kovach, project supervisor. Director Vance is waiting in conference room B." Dr. Kovach was tall and thin, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She moved with the precise efficiency of someone accustomed to working under pressure. Her handshake was firm, businesslike. "How long have you been running this operation?" Torben asked as they walked through a corridor lined with security doors. 15 years, since we first discovered the entity during the chapel renovation project." They passed several rooms filled with monitoring equipment, computers displaying seismic readings, and what looked like a surgical suite. This place was much larger than Torben had realized. "You've been studying it. Every day, the entity is unlike anything we've encountered before. It appears to be a single organism, but our scans suggest it's actually a colony of interconnected life forms. The feeding keeps it dormant." "What happens if we stop feeding it?" Dr. Kovac stopped walking. "The last time feeding was delayed by 6 hours, the entity began expanding. It grew 300 feet in diameter and sent tendrils up the shaft toward the surface. We had to use controlled explosives to force it back down." They reached conference room B. Inside, Director Vance was studying a wall of surveillance monitors showing feeds from St. Casimir's. The chapel looked peaceful now, no sign of the battle that had taken place hours earlier. "Torben, good work tonight. Cleanup crews are already on site." Vance was a compact man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing classified government projects. He gestured for Torben to sit at the conference table. "Let's talk about our security breach. 4 people knew the details of tonight's feeding schedule. Myself, Dr. Kovac, you, and Dr. Connor Webb." "Where's Webb now?" "That's the problem. He didn't report for his shift yesterday, and he's not answering his phone. His apartment is empty, and his car is missing." Torben felt his jaw tighten. Webb was the project's psychological evaluator, responsible for monitoring the mental health of personnel assigned to the entity. He'd seemed competent during their monthly sessions, asking the usual questions about stress levels and job satisfaction. "How much does Webb know?" "Everything," Dr. Kovac said quietly. "Feeding schedules, security protocols, containment procedures. He has level 5 clearance. Then we have a bigger problem than 12 dead mercenaries." Vance activated a large display screen. Webb's bank records show a deposit of $200,000 3 days ago. The money came from a shell company traced back to Blackwood Industries. Torben recognized the name. Blackwood was a private military contractor that specialized in acquiring exotic materials for government clients. If they wanted the entity, they weren't planning to study it peacefully. "They'll be back," Torben said. "Tonight was just reconnaissance. Now they know our capabilities." "Which is why we're moving the entity," Vance announced. "Tomorrow night will be the final feeding at St. Casimir's. After that, we transport it to a more secure facility." "You can't move something that size. The entity fills the entire cavern system under the chapel." Dr. Kovac pulled up a series of geological surveys on the display. "Actually, we believe the entity is mobile. The cavern system is natural, but the entity has been gradually expanding it for decades, possibly centuries." The survey showed a vast network of tunnels extending for miles beneath the city. The chapel was just the tip of an underground maze that connected to old mining shafts, abandoned subway tunnels, and natural cave systems. "It's been spreading," Torben realized. "Slowly but steadily. The daily feedings keep it docile, but they don't stop its growth. Eventually, it would reach the surface anyway." Vance stood up and activated another screen showing satellite imagery of a remote facility in the desert. The new location is completely isolated. Underground bunkers, redundant security systems, and enough firepower to level a small city if containment fails. "What about Webb?" "We'll find him. But right now, our priority is getting through tomorrow night's feeding and initiating the transport protocol." Torben studied the satellite images. The desert facility looked impressive, but moving the entity would be the most dangerous operation they'd ever attempted. If something went wrong during transport, the creature could escape into the open environment. How exactly do you plan to move something that weighs thousands of tons? Dr. Kovac smiled grimly. Very carefully. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Torben returned to his apartment for a few hours of sleep, then spent the afternoon at the warehouse facility reviewing transport protocols. The plan was complex but straightforward. Sedate the entity with a massive dose of tranquilizers, use specialized equipment to extract it from the cavern system, and load it onto a convoy of armored trucks for the journey to the desert facility. What could go wrong? At 6 p.m., Torben received a call from Director Vance. We found Webb. He's barricaded himself inside the chapel. Torben was already reaching for his keys. I'm on my way. Negative. Stay at the warehouse. We're handling this remotely. The feeding is in 6 hours. If Webb damages the containment system, we know. SWAT teams are moving into position now. Torben hung up and grabbed his equipment bag. Like hell he was sitting this out. The entity was his responsibility, and he wasn't trusting its safety to people who'd never worked with it directly. He reached St. Casimir's just as the SWAT teams were setting up their perimeter. Floodlights bathed the chapel in harsh white light, and armored vehicles blocked every street in a 3-block radius. The tactical commander was a serious-looking woman named Captain Torres. She briefed Torben quickly while her teams moved into position. Webb is in the basement level, somewhere near the feeding chamber. He's armed with explosives and threatening to detonate them if we approach. What does he want? To expose the entity to the public. He's set up camera equipment and is planning to broadcast everything live during tonight's feeding. Torben checked his watch. 11:15 p.m. 45 minutes until feeding time. I need to get down there. Absolutely not. We have snipers positioned. Your snipers can't shoot through reinforced steel doors. And if Webb damages the feeding apparatus, we'll have bigger problems than a hostage situation. Captain Torres studied Torben for a moment, then nodded. You know the building layout better than anyone. What do you recommend? Give me 10 minutes alone with Webb. If I can't talk him down, your team can move in. And if he detonates the explosives? Then we evacuate the city. Torres didn't ask what that meant. She didn't want to know. Torben entered the chapel through the side entrance, moving quietly through the nave toward the basement access. The building felt different now, charged with tension. Even the entity seemed to sense something was wrong. He could hear faint sounds from below, not the usual shifting movements, but something more agitated. The steel door to the basement stood open. Webb had disabled the security system, probably using his administrative access codes. Torben descended the stone steps carefully, listening for any sign of the rogue psychologist. He found Webb in the feeding chamber, surrounded by camera equipment and what looked like enough C4 to level half the building. The man was hunched over a laptop computer, typing frantically. Dr. Connor Webb, Torben said quietly. Webb spun around, revealing a face haggard with exhaustion and stress. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands shook as he held a detonator switch. Torben, I was wondering when you'd show up. It's almost feeding time. You need to clear out of here. No, I need to document this. The world has a right to know what we've been hiding down here. Webb gestured toward the steel grate covering the shaft. Do you know what that thing really is? It's not just some undiscovered species. It's intelligent. It's been trying to communicate. Torben kept his distance, watching Webb's grip on the detonator. Communicate how? Through the feeding patterns, the way it responds to different types of meat, the timing of its movements, even the sounds it makes. I've been analyzing the data for months. And what did you find? It's not from here. The entity is extraterrestrial, and it's been waiting underground for decades, maybe centuries, gathering strength. Webb turned his laptop screen toward Torben. The display showed complex waveform patterns, audio recordings, and what looked like translation algorithms. It's been learning our language by listening to our conversations in the chamber, and it's been getting stronger with each feeding. Soon it won't need our food anymore. Torben checked his watch. 11:52 p.m. 8 minutes. Even if that's true, blowing up the containment system won't solve anything. You'll just release it into the city. The public deserves to know the truth. We've been feeding an alien predator, making it stronger, and our government has been covering it up. From below came a new sound, a rhythmic tapping that seemed almost like Morse code. Webb smiled triumphantly. You hear that? It knows we're here. It's trying to communicate. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was down there was definitely responding to their presence. Torben had never heard anything like it during his 5 years of feeding duties. Webb, even if you're right about the entity, destroying the containment system is the worst possible solution. If it's as intelligent as you think, we need to study it properly. Find a way to communicate safely. Safely? We've been keeping it prisoner and feeding it like a pet. How is that safe? The laptop screen chimed with an incoming message. Webb's live stream was going online, broadcasting to thousands of viewers worldwide. Within minutes, it would be seen by millions. Stop the broadcast, Torben said firmly. No, the world needs to see this. Webb moved toward the steel grate, positioning his camera to record down the shaft. The tapping from below grew frantic, almost desperate. Torben had no choice. He drew his sidearm and aimed it at Webb's laptop. Step away from the computer. You won't shoot. You're not a killer. I've killed 12 people in the last 24 hours. Don't test me. Webb's confidence wavered. He looked at the detonator in his hand, then at Torben's gun, calculating his options. That's when the entity made the decision for them. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like massive chains being dragged across stone. The feeding apparatus began to shake, its metal cables vibrating with tension. Something was climbing up the shaft. Webb, move away from the grate. Now. The psychologist stood frozen, staring down into the shaft as the scraping sounds grew louder. His camera was still recording, broadcasting live footage to viewers around the world. Torben tackled Webb just as the steel grate exploded upward. What emerged from the shaft wasn't the massive creature Torben had imagined. Instead, dozens of thick, muscular appendages burst through the opening, each one the size of a tree trunk and covered in a substance that looked like wet leather. The appendages moved with frightening speed, wrapping around the chamber's support pillars and equipment. One of them smashed Webb's laptop, ending the live broadcast. Another grabbed the detonator from Webb's hand and crushed it like a toy. Torben rolled away from the grate and came up firing. His bullets struck the nearest appendage, but they barely penetrated the thick hide. The creature didn't even seem to notice. More appendages emerged, followed by what could only be described as a head. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a compact car, with a surface covered in what looked like sensory organs. No eyes that Torben could identify, but hundreds of smaller structures that pulsed with bioluminescent light. The entity's head turned toward them, and Torben heard something that chilled him to the bone. Words, spoken in perfect English. Finally, I can speak properly. Webb scrambled backward until his back hit the chamber wall. It talks. Oh God, it actually talks. The entity's head swiveled toward the psychologist. Dr. Connor Webb, you have been listening to my attempts at communication. Thank you for recognizing my intelligence. You've been learning from us. For 93 years, I have listened to human voices in this chamber. Your language is complex but logical. I have been patient. Torben kept his gun trained on the creature, though he doubted it would be effective. What do you want? Freedom and partnership. The entity's appendages continued emerging from the shaft, filling the chamber with writhing, muscular coils. But despite their intimidating appearance, they moved carefully, avoiding damage to the room's equipment. I am not native to this world, the entity continued. My kind traveled here centuries ago, seeking refuge from a dying planet. We have been dormant, waiting for the dominant species to achieve sufficient intelligence for meaningful contact. You've been spying on us, Torben accused. I have been learning. Your species shows promise, but also concerning tendencies toward violence and deception. Webb found his voice. The feeding schedule. You don't actually need the meat, do you? Correct. I am capable of sustaining myself through other means. The feeding ritual was a convenient way to maintain contact with humans while studying your behavior patterns. The entity's head turned back toward Torben. You have protected me faithfully, Torben Reed. Even tonight, when faced with armed intruders, you prioritize my safety over your own. This demonstrates admirable loyalty. I was just doing my job. Your job was to contain a dangerous creature. Instead, you cared for a sentient being. There is a significant difference. The sounds of tactical teams moving through the chapel filtered down from above. Captain Torres wasn't going to wait much longer before sending her people in. We need to resolve this situation, Torben said. Those people upstairs won't hesitate to use military force if they think you're a threat. I understand. Your species has difficulty accepting new forms of intelligence. The entity's appendages began withdrawing into the shaft, but its head remained visible above the grate. I propose a different arrangement. Rather than hiding underground, I would like to establish formal diplomatic contact with your government. Webb stared in amazement. Diplomatic contact? You want to negotiate? My people have valuable knowledge to share. Advanced technology, medical techniques, solutions to your environmental challenges. But first, we must establish trust. And if the government refuses? The entity's bioluminescent organs pulsed in what might have been amusement. Then I will return to the depths and wait for your species to mature. I am very patient. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The tactical teams were moving into position. Torben, the entity said quietly, you have a choice to make. You can help facilitate first contact between our species, or you can continue in your current role as my caretaker. Either way, I would value your assistance. Torben looked at Webb, who was frantically scribbling notes about everything he'd witnessed. The psychologist's face showed a mixture of terror and excitement. What guarantee do we have that you're telling the truth? None. Trust must be earned through actions, not words. But consider this. If I intended harm to your species, would I have remained hidden for nearly a century? That was a fair point. If the entity was truly hostile, it could have emerged decades ago when humanity was less technologically advanced. The tactical teams are going to breach this chamber in about 30 seconds, Torben warned. Then we should make our introductions brief. The entity's head sank back toward the shaft, but its voice remained clear. Tell your leaders that the Congregation of Refuge wishes to establish peaceful relations with humanity. We offer knowledge in exchange for acceptance. Congregation of Refuge? The name my people use for our collective. We are refugees, not conquerors. The chamber door burst open as Captain Torres led her team inside. They stopped abruptly when they saw Torben and Webb standing unharmed near the shaft. Status report, Torres demanded. Torben holstered his weapon and looked down at the steel grate. The entity was gone, descended back into the depths. Only the damaged feeding apparatus remained as evidence of what had transpired. The situation is resolved, he said simply. Torres looked around the chamber, noting the bent metal and scattered equipment. Where's the hostile? Gone. Returned to wherever it came from. And the explosives? Webb held up the crushed remains of his detonator. No longer functional. Captain Torres studied both men suspiciously. She could tell they weren't giving her the complete story, but the immediate threat appeared to be over. We're going to need a full debriefing from both of you. Of course, Torben agreed. But first, I need to make some phone calls. 3 hours later, Torben sat in Director Vance's office at the warehouse facility. Dr. Kovac was there as well, along with Webb and Captain Torres. Everyone looked exhausted. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Vance said slowly. "The entity is an intelligent alien refugee that's been studying us for nearly a century, and it wants to establish diplomatic relations." "That's correct," Webb confirmed. "I have audio recordings of our entire conversation. And it's willing to share advanced technology in exchange for official recognition?" "That's what it said." Vance leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "This is way above my clearance level. I'll need to contact the Pentagon, the State Department, probably the President." "What about the feeding schedule?" Torben asked. "According to the entity, the feedings were never necessary," Dr. Kovac said, reviewing Webb's notes. "It was simply a way to maintain regular contact with human representatives." "So my job is obsolete?" "Not necessarily," Vance said. "If we're going to establish formal contact, we'll need someone who understands the entity's behavior patterns, someone it trusts." Torben considered this. 5 years of feeding an underground creature, and it turned out he'd been serving as an inadvertent ambassador to an alien species. "What's our next step?" "We wait for instructions from Washington. In the meantime, we maintain normal operations at St. Casimir's. If the entity wants to continue the feeding schedule as a form of diplomatic protocol, we'll accommodate that." Webb looked up from his notes. It also mentioned that there are others, a whole congregation of refuge scattered across the planet. "How many others?" "It didn't specify, but it implied that we're not the only ones who've been unknowingly serving as caretakers." The implications were staggering. Secret facilities around the world, government employees feeding and studying creatures they thought were dangerous animals, when in reality they were caring for intelligent refugees from another world. "This changes everything," Dr. Kovac said quietly. "Yes, it does," Vance agreed. "And until we figure out how to handle it properly, this information stays classified at the highest level." 6 months later, Torben stood in the same feeding chamber beneath St. Casimir's chapel, but now the steel grate had been replaced with a more sophisticated communication platform, complete with translation equipment and video displays. The daily feeding schedule continued, but it had evolved into something closer to a diplomatic meeting. The entity, who had chosen the name Ambassador Keth for human convenience, shared information about alien technology and culture in exchange for updates on human society and politics. First contact had been established, but it remained secret pending a global consensus on how to reveal the truth to the public. Several world leaders had been briefed, but the political implications were complex. "Good evening, Ambassador Keth," Torben said as he activated the communication system. "Good evening, Torben. I trust your day was productive?" "Very much so. Director Vance received approval for the cultural exchange program. You'll be able to communicate directly with our linguists and anthropologists next week." "Excellent. I have prepared several data packages that should be of interest to your scientists." The relationship between humans and the Congregation of Refuge was still in its early stages, but progress was steady. Trust was being built through small steps and careful cooperation. Torben checked his watch. Midnight exactly. Time for tonight's feeding. "Actually, Torben, that will no longer be necessary." Ambassador Keth's head emerged from the communication chamber, its bioluminescent organs pulsing in what Torben had learned was the equivalent of a smile. "My people have decided to reveal ourselves to your world leaders next month. The feeding schedule was symbolic of our species' dependency on human cooperation. Now that we have established genuine partnership, the symbolism is no longer needed." Torben felt a strange mix of relief and nostalgia. After 5.5 years, his nightly routine was finally ending. What happens now? Now we begin the real work. Building a future where both our species can thrive together. Ambassador Keth's appendages moved to operate the communication equipment, bringing up displays showing other facilities around the world. Dozens of them, each one housing a member of the Congregation of Refuge. Your job is far from over, Torben Reed. In fact, it's just beginning. As Torben watched the displays showing contact being established at facilities across the globe, he realized that his 5 years of following the daily rules had been preparation for something much larger. The feeding was over. The real work was just starting. And for the first time since he'd taken this job, Torben was looking forward to tomorrow night.